As Gary said, I'm a professor of psychology. I'm also a detective in NYPD, focusing primarily on police officers that have psychological problems. Certainly after 9/11, the caseload that I have was almost overwhelming, as you can imagine. And Gary asked me to speak on processing the feelings. Naturally, after a play of this impact, it leaves you feeling something. At least, hopefully, for the actors and the audience, you're left feeling something. There's something happening. You feel maybe buzzed, a little bit sad, a whole range of different emotions that, after seeing something like this, gets raised, gets generated. So it's a very informal discussion. Feel free to just yell out any reaction or response that you had. I understand the purpose of taking a little break in between is sort of to step away from that emotion that you might be feeling. It's, I would imagine for the actors going through this, it can also have an impact to play the volunteer, to play the person processing this activity, to be sort of a part of it, if you will. Even acting, sort of, it takes a toll. It takes a certain amount of internal, I don't know, fortitude, or I'm sure there's a part of you that looks to see how you can perform. You have to put on your game face to be a terrorist, to, I guess, hire a terrorist. So I'd like to ask, are there any reactions that either the cast or the audience has in just seeing it? Any things that come to mind? I mean, I think the play really touches on so many different areas of life that we could all sort of identify with. But I don't want to give away those areas. Has anyone had a connection, or I've been there sort of experience with anything that happened? Especially with Vic. Has anyone ever applied for a job and hoped you got picked over other applicants that may be equally qualified? Has that ever happened? And to get picked, what that really means, how great you feel, right? What are some of the things that people identify with? Are we too shocked? This is the interactive part. I know we used to talk about computers, and you just click on a mouse and have a response, but I am actually looking for an interaction.
I saw some hands there.
I was surprised that you wrote this before 9/11.
Oh, thank you. I'm grateful that you brought that up. And the reason that I wrote it, I've never been a terrorist, but I read about a story in the New York Times reported that in an Eastern European newspaper there was this was in '87, that there was an ad that said suicide bomber $75,000, grenade attack $5,000. Basically it was a help wanted ad for terrorists. And I thought, just that alone is the premise for a play. How would you approach that? And so I thought, what would the interview be like? And then I just started and I wrote the play completely, a stream of, as it came out of my subconscious, I guess. And at that time I was aware of, I lived in New York from about 1981, and there actually had been a bombing in New York. The FALN in the early 80s, which was a Puerto Rican revolutionary group, actually had planted a bomb in New York. But it didn't make a lot of news, and at the same time we heard about terrorism in other parts of the world, but they were a variety of places. So it seemed to me, especially based upon this ad, that terrorism could be thought of as an activity that's separate from the cause, and that there were a lot of terrorists. And I lived in England, and during the time when the Irish Republican Army was bombing in London, and in Europe when Baader-Meinhof and Red Army were bombing in Germany and Italy, And there were even the weathermen were bombing in the United States in the 60s and early 70s. So I had maybe an experience of bombing and terrorism because I lived overseas. It wasn't quite so common in America. And that just made me think about terrorism in a very generic way. And that's what led to the writing of this play. And I think part of the meaning of the play for me just is that you can write about terrorism and the activity of terrorism distinct from writing about or thinking about the cause. And to me that was also the humor of this.
One thing that was observed was there was a lot of laughing, and there were a lot of humorous parts to the play, but some of it wasn't humorous, but there was still a lot of sort of laughter. And I imagine that's a way of dealing with, and that's how we deal with some of the things that really hit us close to home. In terms of expressing a sadness or a wish for better things, we might laugh at it because, well, number one, we want to push it away. We don't want it to be painful. And number two, we're out in public. We don't want to break down. We don't want to really focus on what's really happening. We want to be entertained, and that laughter is sort of like a byproduct of it. But we all realize what's going on in the world, and it's good to be able to step away from it and sort of view it in another context. In this instance, the business world of hiring, firing, getting selected. I mean, there's so many different themes. New relationships. Do we remember the first kiss with somebody that we fell in love with? That was one of the, one of the themes that were identified. The joy of that, and the hope. In this context, the hope for the afterlife of going different places, seeing different sights. So you could sort of relate to taking pictures, going on vacation, going to the movies for the first time, how much noise you're making, are you disturbing the other moviegoers, that type of thing. The shyness, just the human nature of this process. I guess one of the questions for the actors, any feelings about the roles that you played? I mean, do you...
Where to start?
Where to start, yeah.
Well...
No, you played number 6 and
volunteer too.
And I'd like to point out, Adam was an Israeli paratrooper.
So, yeah, I was also dealing with terrorism before it became fashionable.
Fortunately. In this country?
No, overseas as well, in Israel.
Is that right?
And just when suicide bombings were coming out, that was during the time that I was serving, and when we were supposed to keep track of them. So, one thing which I told Gary before about the play that strikes me is the image of taking a picture of them. It creepily reflects on what we're seeing today when we see the pictures of these guys.
Smiling? They're happy?
In our play they're smiling and they're in coveralls, and yet it's kind of like an alternate universe of they're holding their Kalashnikovs and wearing their keffiyehs, and they're ready to go out for their mission with all their people behind them. And kudos to you. You broke down something through laughter, as you said. When we don't know what to do, we laugh, and there are many different kinds of laughter. That's a laughter of recognition. Now to answer your question. As volunteer, I was just pretty much saw it as this is the world that this play exists in, and my job is to just be the one that gets selected and do whatever I need to do to get selected.
Right.
And as a corporal, I'm just the utility man, and it's kind of like, I feel like we're a society of enablers for one alcoholic, that we're all doing our bit to enable him to do his mission. And my guy is the responsible one who never has fun and who never gets the girl.
Searching, trying, but...
Yeah, searching and doing everything right, not figuring out what the hell is wrong here. And basically, the weirdest thing for me every time I've heard this is I'm rooting for this guy to get his job done. And then when I realize he gets his job done, he just died.
Right.
Well, what were we doing in this world?
Right, exactly. So there's sort of a separation. You're cheering him on, and you sort of lose track of what he's going to do. It could be anything. He could be maybe just hit a home run. Maybe he
sacked the quarterback instead
exactly.
of sacking him. This time you killed him.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. It's very, very powerful.
I want to ask you, as a specialist in terrorism, though.
Well, I'm not actually a specialist in terrorism.
Okay.
But basically, as a psychologist, I deal with police officers who experience the terrorism firsthand, dealing with a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder. So terrorism isn't my niche,
Okay.
but it's slowly becoming part of it.
I guess my question to all of us is, can you separate it from the cause?
Can you separate the...
You know, can you... I mean, it's interesting, Gary, that you do take it at, you know, based on the ad and taking it out of context and putting it, setting it up like an employment agency, you know. But can you really separate terrorism from the reason why they're doing it?
From whose perspective?
Suicide bomb, you know.
Political, sure. Let me. I'm going to encourage you to answer the question this way. I think that suicide, what they might have in common is hopelessness, you know, and that there might be certain kinds of psychological characteristics, you know, that they would have in common. Now, and sort of what I'm flipping to you is this: is there a certain pathology? Would you say that there's a certain kind of profile of a suicide bomber, or a certain pathology that leads people to be more likely to be suicide bombers? Was this closer?
Yeah.
Well, I believe that it depends. It's a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah.
It really depends on how you're interpreting what you do. For example, we have people in the military who know that part of their job might be sacrifice, might be to get killed. To imagine a volunteer or somebody in the reserves who is really a clerk, let's say in a grocery store, all of a sudden they're put into this situation where they might be killed. For a lot of us, that would take a whole lot of commitment to actually get on a plane and say, you know what, I've been playing soldier for a long time, now I'm really going to do it, and I might get killed doing it. In that context, the characteristics of that individual may be, I'm doing this for my country, I'm doing this for the greater good, and these are a lot of the characteristics that the terrorists describe. So they're willing to sacrifice your own life for this cause. We could put other labels on it as pathology, and that makes us feel more comfortable, because it has to be something wrong with doing this. But if you look at Greek mythology, suicide on the battlefield was honorable, right? To take your own life was the honorable thing to do. So those characteristics are played out with a lot of what's going on today. Even as horrendous as they are. The more recent one, the Russian incident where the school children were killed, you're thinking, how could anyone think this is an honorable thing to do? To kill children in cold blood. But again, looking at it from their perspective, this is their last resort. This is what they are trying to do. Could be some pathology involved, but I don't know if that's going to satisfy us, to give us the answer, to say they're psychopaths. that they are heartless, they are, I would love to say that, but is that really the case? I know we would like to say it, but I think their investment in this activity is something very personal to them. And I guess politically, if you look at soldiers, maybe even police officers, to go into a line of work that's potentially you can get killed. An example of it just a few nights ago, with 2 officers getting killed. What would make a person do that? To sacrifice themselves for a particular cause?
I think one of the things that I find interesting about the play, in regards to can you separate terrorism from the sort of political cause or the cause that they might subscribe to, is that from the individual level you probably can, and that's probably the danger of creating a culture of terrorism, is that whoever's running this agency probably has a cause. And we can imagine they have a strong will and a strong agenda, but the odds that the person that actually chooses to sacrifice themselves may well have not a strong will and strong agenda. In fact, I think part of what this play suggests is that they're very much people. They're very fallible. They'll have likes and dislikes, insecurities, and as with anyone, they'll want a sense of pride and accomplishment, and they may live or be in a place where there's just not offered anywhere else, so that while they end up getting connected to the cause, the terrorism itself is more of a commodity. In other words, there's people out there like, I'm willing to kill myself, and there's other people who are like, I need someone to kill myself for my cause. So they get hooked up, so it looks like a cause, but at some level, I think for some people, it probably doesn't matter. What matters is the honor and the sense of what they've done, but they'll be happy to take it from whoever is sort of leading the culture at the
So
time.
but what about the character that you were playing? Because he didn't seem to have a cause except a kind of utility and hopelessness about himself, and no real relationships. He didn't have anybody to leave his money to. His parents were not his family. So what did you use inside yourself as the kind of motivating?
Well, I certainly not a big cause. I mean, what I use is the sense of how someone can get to that point where personally you've reached a point where you're not interested in what you can do with your own life anymore, where you feel like you've expended all your opportunities. And I think that's something we probably all relate to at some levels, like hitting the wall. And then somebody who at that point chooses to reach out to somebody else's cause. The idea that, well, if I go to this place, they'll put my name on a monument. Like, I don't have anything left with my life. What in dying can I accomplish? And there aren't many places you can do that. There aren't many places where you can say, well, short of like coming up with a new life plan, if it comes down to my final act just being death, what could I possibly do? This is kind of the only opportunity you have. And again, I think what's interesting to me about it is, it very much strikes me as that could be something that people that plan and run terrorist operations prey upon, is people who've reached an absolute sense of futility with their own life, so they're very easy to lure in with that.
That's what I was seeing in the play.
Yeah.
Actually, it was, this guy was just...
Right, that he could have walked into, by chance, if he'd walked into maybe a cult, they'd take him. If he happened to walk into
Macy's.
Macy's, he'd be an elf, but that, yeah, he was looking for something. This is
You
what
might
he
have
found.
guys blowing up the floats, right?
Yeah.
Good, yeah.
But then you have the economic motivation.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I really like about the play is that, in some ways with the main character, Vic, I think there's a sense that there's the futility that brings him in and the promise of the economics, but we sort of see that really the money may not matter to him. But I think it does point to something that happens a lot, which is I think money gives a little bit of a validation that people have a sense, well, like, it becomes worth something then. Certainly in the case of large monetary payments that they can give to their family or even the community, it can raise them to a place. And what I love about the play, and sort of going back to your comment about the Fahrenheit 9/11, is I think this play really shows that killing yourself becomes a commodity, and that by taking it out of a particular cause or a particular country or a particular people, you're saying that at some level it's a free market, it's a market economy, and that killing yourself has a value, whatever the cause. We don't, it could be personal, it could be national, it could be religious, but at some level we've hit a point now, because I think this may be a little different than in the past, like in the sense of Greek mythology, earlier times, that maybe I'm totally wrong with mercenaries, but that this is something that you can easily buy, and that people feel like it's something they can sell, which I think is important to know because it suggests a really dangerous time ahead when you've got people with a ton of money and a ton of people with no money, and the only thing they've got is their ability to sort of rock the world in these horrendous ways.
Yeah, I lived 3 blocks south of the world, did live 3 blocks south of the World Trade Center, and I still live there. Because I was made homeless for 3 months by the disaster and was emotionally affected by it, I felt in a certain way that I was entitled to express opinions, my own doubts about, common views of terrorism. By being a victim, in a certain sense, I felt I was allowed to really speak my mind. And one of the conclusions that I reached after that time was that if we examine world history, we can see many circumstances of terrorism. And I'll give you some. What I mean is, for example, the American Indians that attacked the settlers, in the United States, were probably regarded as terrorists. They would, take scalps. They would attack civilians. That they would, kill women and children, steal children. Those are, from our perspective now, obviously terrorist acts. But from their point of view, the settlers were settling, taking over their land. So were the settlers invaders, or were they instruments of an invading army? Later, you could have regarded the American revolutionaries, the British could have regarded the American revolutionaries as terrorists because they were soldiers without uniforms, that they weren't fighting a traditional war. In Vietnam, children would run up to soldiers and have bombs strapped to them and they would blow up. Were they being manipulated? Probably, but still you had children essentially behaving as suicide bombers. So that I think, and the most well-known, I suppose, suicide attackers from our cultural history would be the kamikaze pilots in World War II, the Japanese pilots who would crash their planes into ships. Even though it's a cultural phenomenon, I think it's across many different cultures, and there are many different ways to see terrorism from the point of view of the terrorist as a revolutionary act or a patriotic act, not a wanton, insane act.
One thing I enjoy about the scene with Vic and Corporal Six and Daisy discussing, and the sort of a heated exchange with Corporal Six about would you die and what's a coward. I think partly, what we're talking about is that terrorism is something that's malleable in its definition. I mean, it's defined perhaps by the targets, and yet that can be defined by whoever's doing it. I mean, obviously for those people involved in the terror acts, they probably don't think of it as innocent lives, like it's the enemy. On top of which, you define the terms of what the effect will be, like you're trying to create this terror. And I think at some level it begins to be clear how muddy a line it is to say what is terrorism versus warfare versus these other things.
I have to say I'm very sympathetic to your perspective. I mean, I think it's especially frightening that our president and also Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, are identifying as terrorists essentially military enemies of their country and willing to perpetrate either preemptive acts or essentially military acts without conscience, basically, because they're right, because they're fighting terrorists, and they don't have to identify the terrorist as having any legitimate rationale or a legitimate identity as a nation or as a political group.
Evildoers.
Well, yeah, that exactly. That to me is the frightening thing.
Yeah, and I think one thing that this play, I think it's nice to have is I spoke with someone recently just about what was going on in the world. And the thing they were so clear on is like, well, we never need to get into the mind of a terrorist because we know they're evil. Like, so that's case closed. When I was trying to discuss, like, well, it's important to know their way of life. If you've identified a particular either ethnic or religious group and that is perpetrating terrorism, it's important to know where they're coming from, just on in a strictly defensive posture, like to know them better. And he was so like, well, no, you don't need to. How could you ever? And I thought, oh, there's the danger. Like, there's what we run into. Like, the moment you imagine that these are born evil people with nothing but evil on their mind, then you've already sort of lost the battle, because you're not going to be able to understand, like, no, they're coming from somewhere, even if it's just a lost soul looking for a cause or the higher cause. And that it's very important to keep that open mind, that we need to look at who these people are, which this play does comedically in a nice way, but suggests like, oh, you know what? Because then I think it says, well, maybe there's another place to affect it. Maybe it's not just trying to kill everyone who thinks it's terrorist, but maybe there's another place you can enter into their world and have an effect.
I think there should be a hesitancy to label terrorism, and I think that's one of the things that's coming out, is that there, at least in my belief, there is no one profile of a terrorist. There are different causes, whether culturally, religiously, and it's scary to think that way, because it would make us feel a lot better if we could say, okay, there's a particular characteristic that will identify a terrorist so that they can be isolated and prevented from acting.